Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Today's episode is one of the most terrible, perhaps the most terrible murder stories I have ever encountered. The crime itself could hardly be more graphic, the victim more faultless, nor the fallout more tragic. And the decade-long domino effect of this particular murder only deepens the pall of horror cast by that which should not be. How does an alien-hunting cannibal, that's right, I said alien-hunting cannibal, walk free with the blessing of the state, while witnesses and family members remain forever incarcerated in a prison of recurrent horror, sleeplessness, alcoholism, and PTSD? Though evil forced the query, it is a good question, and one of several we'll grapple with here on the show today in an episode entitled Greyhound Horror and the Canadian Cannibal, the brutal beheading of Timothy McLean. But I almost called this episode simply Questions for Canada. Hello everyone, I'm your host Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Thank you for deciding to be here. As always, I'd like to acknowledge anyone living with a disability, and anyone whose family, friends, or loved ones may be living with a disability, physical or otherwise. I know what it's like, and I'm here for you. Remember that the challenges you face don't define you, and should never be a source of shame. You are not broken. If you'd like someone to talk to, or if you'd like to share a story of living with a disability to help yourself or others feel seen and supported, please reach out to the show via email, kindamurdery@gmail.com, or @kindamurdery on social media. Also, I know today's show is a little shorter than normal. I hope that's alright. My entire family has COVID right now. Watch out for camping trips and sleeping in tents, I say. Well, I'm still testing negative, but it'll be a minor miracle if I avoid it entirely. I'm sitting in the house with a mask on, recording this episode while doing my best to balance caregiving, carefulness, and recording around coughing fits. Thankfully, the cases seem to be mild, and everyone is trending positively at the moment, so fingers crossed. Alright, we're going to dive right into the story today, mostly because darkness generates its own compulsive emotional momentum, which is to say, if I don't dive right in immediately, I'm afraid I may just run away and shirk my responsibilities entirely. This is a story that takes courage to tell, though the ounce of bravery required of me is a mere atom in the ocean compared to the courage required to live through it. This is a recent story. The murder was committed in 2008. Survivors and loved ones are still alive. My heart goes out to Timothy McLean's family and everyone who witnessed Tim's murder that day, and anyone whose life was personally touched by this terrible tragedy in any way. Now, usually I'm not much of a believer in trigger warnings. Although their intent may be noble, I believe that they preemptively communicate the assumption that we are not strong enough to handle whatever's coming. And I would never assume that of you or myself. I believe that we are stronger and can handle more than we know. But with that being said, I'm going to offer a trigger warning today for graphic violence, PTSD, family separation, substance abuse, and, frankly, more. Now, one last thing before we dive in, I want to establish the central question that frames the story I'm about to tell, And this would be the central question for the nation of Canada, I suppose. What is the purpose of criminal penalties, and in particular, incarceration? Are penalties meant as deterrence or consequences? Is incarceration meant to rehabilitate or to punish? In my mind, the answer is clearly both. There are often many mitigating circumstances that lead a person to commit murder. And if a repentant killer can be truly rehabilitated, that is a worthy goal. But there are some crimes so heinous that they demand punishment, where even legitimate mitigating circumstances like mental illness feel like feeble justification for compassion. In my mind, the case of the Canadian cannibal is one of those cases. But the Canadian justice system clearly disagreed. Let's get into it. Vincent Li was born in northeastern China in the province of Liaoning, and I probably mispronounced that, in 1968. In 2001, at the age of 33, Vincent and his wife immigrated to Winnipeg, Canada. Li had studied for 4 years as a software engineer in China, but was unable to get a job in a related field. He took jobs at McDonald's, Walmart, Meatland Foods, and Grant Memorial Baptist Church. Li, an exceptionally devout Christian, had this to say about his spirituality. I believe in Jesus Christ. He is my Savior. I try to follow God. In 2004, 3 years after he immigrated to Canada, Vincent Li began to have schizophrenic episodes, although he did not know what they were at the time. Again, I'll turn to Vincent Li's own words as he describes the emergence of his schizophrenia in 2004. He says, "I began to hear voices that normal people do not hear. I thought I heard the voice of God telling me to write down my journey. The voice told me that I was the third story of the Bible, that I was like the second coming of Jesus. I was to save people from a space alien attack. That is why I traveled around the country. I am not sure of all the places I went to. I now know that it was schizophrenia I was suffering from." That's the end of Vincent Li's words for now. Now, the anti-psychiatry psychiatrist-philosopher Thomas Szaz, maybe? S-Z-A-Z? If you know the right way to pronounce this guy's name, Thomas Szaz, S-Z-A-Z, reach out to the show and let me know. kindamurdery@gmail.com. And also, as I said last week, and this will be true every week, if there's a particular murder story that you would like to hear me cover, and last week we did Joaquin Murrieta at the request of Amber Suri. If there's a particular story you would like to hear me cover, reach out to the show, kindamurdery@gmail.com or at kindamurdery on social media. Back to the story. The anti-psychiatry psychiatrist Thomas Szaz, I'm going to say Szaz for now, again, let me know the right way to say it, is credited with the saying, "If you talk to God, you're praying. If God talks to you, you have schizophrenia." In the case of Vincent Li, his religious fervor channeled his delusions in a dangerous direction. The potent combination of belief and mental illness left him uncritical of God's voice in his head telling him he was the second coming of Jesus, and it was his job to kill space aliens as the lone protector of humanity. Tragically for Tim McLean and his family, on July 30th, 2008, on Greyhound bus number 1170 bound for Winnipeg, Canada, Vincent Li heard the voice of God tell him it was time to pick up the mantle of alien-slaying Jesus. On July 30th, 2008, Tim McLean boarded Greyhound bus 1170 bound for Winnipeg, Canada. He'd been working a carnival in Alberta and was napping with his head against the window, exhausted after a long night out. Tim was sleeping for almost 6 hours when the bus made a rest stop in Erickson, Manitoba, and a tall Asian man named Vince Lee boarded the bus and sat down in a seat by himself. As the bus pulled out of the stop, he moved to the back, to the vacant seat next to McLean. McLean barely noticed, continuing to sleep with his head against the window and his headphones on. Suddenly, almost 3 hours after boarding, Lee pulled out a large knife and stabbed McLean. The bus was full, and all 34 passengers were witnesses to the carnage. A couple who were sitting across the aisle from Vince Lee were the first to notice and the first to scream. They ran to the front of the bus to tell the driver, who immediately pulled over, evacuating the passengers while leaving Lee locked inside. For the next 4 hours, the passengers remained outside the bus while Lee wreaked havoc inside. Vince Lee had not only stabbed McLean, but decapitated him, carrying his severed head around the bus like a trophy and holding it up for the passengers outside to see. He dismembered McLean's body, tossing the pieces around the bus. He tried at one point to steal the bus, but the quick thinking of the driver had engaged an emergency stop feature, rendering the bus immobile. Lee also tried to flee the bus, though a group of passengers kept him contained. A passing truck driver who had been carrying steel pipe had seen the roadside commotion and had stopped to see what was wrong. When the passengers told him what Lee was doing, he grabbed a pipe from his truck and stood guard outside the doors until police arrived. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police finally did arrive, they ended up in a standoff for over 2 hours. They watched as Vince Lee paced back and forth up and down the bus, holding McLean's severed head. After some time, they even observed him eating the dismembered parts of McLean's body. Oh, God. The standoff finally ended when Lee tried to escape by breaking a window. The police caught him, shot him twice with a taser, and handcuffed him, placing him in the back of a police cruiser. In his pockets, they found Timothy McLean's ears, tongue, and nose. Tim's eyes and heart were never found. They were believed to have been eaten by Vince Lee during his time in the bus. The trial took place 1 year later, during which Lee pleaded not criminally responsible. His plea meant that he accepted the charges but was unable to form the necessary mental element to be responsible for them. A psychiatrist on Lee's defense team argued that Lee attacked McLean because God's voice told him McLean was a force of evil and needed to be executed, that McLean was in fact an evil alien. The judge accepted the psychiatrist's diagnosis and remanded Lee to a mental institution. The trial also forced Greyhound to redo their marketing techniques, as they had just released a campaign based on the friendliness of the bus system. And the slogan was, "There's a reason you've never heard of bus rage." In the words of the great Stephen Sondheim, irony, oh, it cuts like a knife. Vince Lee sat in isolation in the Selkirk Mental Health Center in Selkirk, Manitoba for 3 years until his doctors granted him access to the outside world. He was now allowed to take supervised visits to the town square and to conduct interviews about his imprisonment and his crime. 2 years later, doctors decided that Lee's visits to the town no longer needed to be supervised and granted him 30 minutes a day, and eventually full days to be on his own in the town. In 2015, Lee's doctors expanded his visit range to Winnipeg, allowing him unrestricted access to the town as long as he carried a functioning telephone with him. In 2016, Lee formally changed his name and announced that he was seeking the clearance to live independently outside of the mental facility. And in 2017, Lee's petition was granted. A judge on the Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board ordered Lee to be discharged and ruled that there shall be no legal obligations or restrictions on his independent living. He now lives as a free man in Canada under the name William Lee Baker. As to the question of whether or not he should be free, I believe the answer is clearly not, and especially not with no supervision. Even if you don't prioritize justice for Tim McLean's family at all, and you should, everyone behind Will Baker's release will tell you that he's not a threat as long as he's on his meds. Now, it shows incredible cockiness on the part of the Canadian justice system. It is almost, in my opinion, unbelievably arrogant to have utter certainty that A, Will Baker will continue to take his meds. Who among us has not known a mentally ill person who was stable on their medication and manic without it, but nonetheless chose to stop taking it at some point or another? And, by the way, it's not as though Will Baker was just manic when he's off his meds. No. Off his meds, he's a violent cannibal with a god complex. I could hardly think of a more dangerous way to describe someone. A violent cannibal with a god complex. Yeah, sounds perfectly safe for everyone around him. It is true that he's shown a great deal of remorse. So okay, let's say that Vincent Lee, aka Will Baker, would never for the rest of his natural life, an average of at least 30 some odd more years of being healthy and strong enough to be dangerous, let's say he would never choose to go off his meds. Well, Canada is willing to presume that he will always have access to his meds every day for the next 3 decades. There'll never be a shortage. There'll never be a distribution or a transportation problem. There'll never be a supply chain issue. Yeah, right, sure. That's a hell of an assumption to bet people's lives on for the next 30 years because, again, he was released without any qualifications or legal requirements to his continued freedom. So here's hoping he doesn't run out of those meds because, meanwhile, the dominoes that fell because of Will Baker's deadly delusions left so many lives shattered. For the obvious reasons I've just outlined, Timothy McLean's parents do not believe that Vincent Lee should be a free man. Additionally, Tim has a 13-year-old son who was born to Tim's fiancée in December of 2008, 5 months after his father was murdered. Tim's son lives with his paternal grandmother, a last blessing left behind by her beloved son. Should he be forced to live with the knowledge that his father's killer is free under his own recognizance and a new name? And, while Tim's family may have or certainly did suffer the most because of Will Baker's crime, they are not the only ones who have suffered. One of the passengers on the bus that night suffers from mental illness and PTSD because of the horror she was forced to bear witness to, and though she gave birth years later, she would eventually lose custody of her child because of the same PTSD that she developed that terrible night. The truck driver who pulled over to help that night is living with severe PTSD from seeing Vincent Lee walk through the bus carrying the severed head of Timothy McLean. His post-traumatic stress syndrome manifests itself through rage and alcoholism, and he drinks himself to sleep every night because booze is the only way he can sleep. Without it, the horrible imagery of Tim McLean's murder keeps him awake night after night after night. These are the prisons of trauma that the witnesses and family members will live in for the rest of their lives. And, while it's to his credit that Vincent Lee, aka William Lee Baker, has expressed great remorse over the murder he committed, and that remorse will keep him from ever being happy for a single day in his life. While that great regret is laudable, I find myself forced to ask again, for the safety of others, and in the interest of justice for his victims and their families, should Vincent Lee be living unincarcerated? Again, even if no one bears him any ill will, it seems to me that objectively the answer is no, he should not, and that the Canadian justice system has given a philosophical ideal, that ever-elusive goal of prisoner rehabilitation, primacy ahead of very real, concrete concerns in regards to both public safety and justice and peace of mind, though they may be impossible to attain for the Canadian cannibals' victims. And there's one last thing that bothers me. Let's run down the timeline of Vincent Lee's actions leading up to Timothy McLean's murder. From January to June 2008, Lee works at the Clairview Mall Walmart in Edmonton as a janitor, mechanic, and later as a cashier. He mostly kept to himself, though staff there said he was let go after a disagreement with a fellow employee. Then, in July 2008, he returns to his newspaper delivery job. On the morning of July 28, 2008, Lee delivers his last set of newspapers. Midnight, on July 28th in Edmonton, he boards a Greyhound bus bound for Winnipeg. On July 29th, around 6 p.m., Lee gets off the bus in Erickson, Manitoba, with at least 3 pieces of luggage. He spends a long time in the M&M grocery store and then, according to one witness, passes the night on a park bench. On the morning of July 30th, the day that Tim McLean was killed, from the park bench, he sells his new laptop computer to a 15-year-old boy for $60 and tosses in the computer bag for free. He spends most of that afternoon in an alley beside the grocery store. Shortly before 6 p.m., Lee boards the fateful bus heading to Winnipeg, which is carrying Tim McLean and 35 other passengers. On July 30th at 7 p.m., that bus arrives in Brandon, where the driver gives passengers extra time to eat. At 7:30, the bus departs, with the movie Zorro playing on the TV screens. At approximately 9 p.m., the attack takes place about 10 kilometers east of Portage la Prairie, Manitoba. According to some of those on board, the bus driver ushered all the passengers out of the bus while the attack was taking place and disabled the bus so it could not be driven away. July 31st, 1:38 a.m., Lee allegedly broke a window on the bus, threw out a knife and scissors, and then jumped out. He was immediately arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. August 5th. In a brief court appearance, Lee's only words were to ask the judge, "Please, kill me." That's heavy. And that certainly seems like a remorseful person. But I gotta tell you, selling the computer for $60 on the morning of the murder, that bugs me. It suggests a rational person who knows he will soon have no need of the new laptop, as opposed to someone who was seized by sudden madness and decided to commit a cannibalistic murder. Perhaps Vincent Lee, aka Will Baker, didn't know that Tim McLean would be the alien he was destined to kill, but essentially by basically giving away his laptop on the day of the murder, especially since he had 3 other bags, so it's not as though he was meaningfully unencumbering himself by selling the computer. Selling it suggests a man that may have known murder was in his immediate future. In other words, he saw for himself a very near future where he would have no need of a laptop and wouldn't care whether or not he got a good deal on it. In fairness, I do believe that Vincent Lee's remorse is genuine, but because of the possibility that he could lose access to his medication or simply decide to stop taking it, because that possibility even exists at all, regardless of whether it ever occurs, the Greyhound Cannibal should not be living free and unincarcerated. It is incredible that he received an absolute discharge of his crime and that there are no longer any conditions on his freedom. Will Lee Baker has demonstrated that he is capable of horrific destruction, and he should not have total freedom on the grounds that as long as he takes his meds he isn't dangerous anymore, any more than a civilian should be given a hand grenade to carry through town because, after all, as long as the pin isn't removed, a hand grenade is completely safe. Right? I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family, tell strangers, leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.